Well, good morning, everybody. I'm really glad to be here. I want to congratulate Fullerton College for being the first community college to celebrate its centennial. I think it's a milestone when California now has a community college that's 100 years old. And I'm impressed with this conversation and this kind of embracing of what's the next 100 years to look like, and what can we do about it? What do we want to do about it? And the thread that I do hope to kind of put into this very rich conversation is around governance, which in a very pedestrian kind of definition is how do we make decisions? And of course, everybody is wanted to be humble here because we all wanted to acknowledge that there's a lot of uncertainties about the future. As I was kind of contemplating that, I live in Northern California, and I was thinking, not only did the Miwok not know there was gold in those hills, John Sutter didn't know that there was gold in those hills. And so we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or the next day, right? Leland Stanford didn't know about silicon chips. Walt Disney didn't know about streaming video, right? I think some of us that remember the beginning of the war on terrorism were kind of struck when Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld said, "We don't know what we don't know," as we launched into two wars in countries that most Americans can't find on a map. And so I think we do need to be humble. At the same time, we need to be smart about how do we prepare in order to survive and potentially and hopefully thrive. And so while there's many things we don't know, there's a few things we do know, right? And the two that I think certainly within the last 10 years have come to really dominate lots of public policy and governance discussions is those two megatrends that we know will shape the future. And the first is extraordinary global competitiveness. And all of you in the room, I think, have some set of data rolling in your head around China or around South Asia or around Latin America, whether you're involved in high technology, whether you're involved in the agriculture in the Central Valley. So much of what our future markets look like, so much of the future cost factors, so much of what we will have to do in order to be economically competitive will not be defined on our local markets. They'll be defined on global markets. And the second is climate change, right? And we can have a great debate. We're certainly having it in Northern California about whether or not the drought we're seeing is weather or climate. But I'm on my local water board, and I can tell you that we spend as much time planning for the next 50 years as we do for the next 5 months. And so clearly in California and its Mediterranean climate in particular, as a coastal state, we have a lot to be thinking about our infrastructure and our investments. The second thing that I think as Californians now, as part of our legacy, and maybe the last 100 years of higher education is, with Fullerton as a benchmark there is a good example, was we know that so much of what we accomplished in California was a combination of our natural resources, which we used and in many cases overused, as well as the investments we made, both in natural resources and in human capital. And again, I think I can almost leave that at the headlines because you all understand that in great depth, right? But we can point to the water investments, the transportation investments. We also do need to point to our investments in human capital, particularly education and higher education. And we know that we're going to need to continue to do that in the future. And as we were just discussing, and has been brought up by some of the earlier speakers, certainly in these conversations around how do we do this isn't just about re-upping our investments. It's about figuring out what the smart investments are. So the conversation around energy, right, is a really good example of how do we have this conversation at the intersection of private investors and technology and R&D with publicly owned utilities that are highly regulated with a government agency with that the panoply of government agencies that are trying to set policy. And how do we do that in a much smarter way? How do we do it around higher education? And so we're challenged that if our recipe for success in California has been investing in our resources, both physical, natural, and then the human resources, how do we do that in ways that are even smarter? As we put together this one slide around the bullet train, as I go around the state, this can either be a highly divisive or the perfect example. But maybe that's why we left it. We said these aren't going to be easy choices. These are going to be really hard choices because it's hard to see around those corners. And yet we're going to have to figure out how we do this, right? One of the reviews that came out on Caltrans yesterday, among the many, many things it said is wrong with our Department of Transportation, it first said this is still viewed as a Department of Roads and not a Department of Mobility. And you can just think of the cultural change that comes if you had a state agency that was focused on how do we move people and goods, not how do we pave roads and fill potholes, right? So that's that kind of mind shift that leads to that. I want to remind everybody we've been in the governance business since 2008 at California Forward, and in 2009 everybody was really pretty much ready to call California a failed state. This was The Economist from May 2009, and the story, the headline on that story, by the way, when you flipped open, said that California was on the verge of being a failed state, and it would require, and likely we would see, a brand new constitution in order for California to be governable again. In that same year, the Claremont Review of Books put out a very long, exhaustive article that was simply titled "Failed State." And Kevin Starr, right, the prolific former state librarian, the official, if not the unofficial, if not the official state historian, said California was on the verge of being a failed state. That was 2009. Clearly, we're not a failed state. Clearly, there's a lot of things going for us, and we continue to make progress. So what have we done about that? Why is it that we've gone in a relatively few short years from everybody writing our obituary to people now actually looking to California as having invented and created some of the reforms that are going to be necessary to govern in the next 100 years? And again, to just kind of be simple about it, but I don't think inaccurate, there are certain things around our governance system that are broken. And there are just parts of it that are old or that are missing, right? We have 21st century challenges here, and we've got to have some governance to do it. So let's talk first a little bit about some of the things that are broken. California Forward has recognized from the beginning that there's no silver bullets. There's not one problem. There's a set of problems. And what we need to do is, and we're not going to fix them all, but we don't have to. There's lots of people out there that are trying to fix pieces of it, but we have to have a sense of the whole. And building off of all of the work that was done previously, we identified that there are clearly a set of political reforms that we need to put in place in order to reduce the kind of hyper-partisanship that was certainly gridlocking the state capitol. And we identified some of those and worked on them with Common Cause and some of your other more traditional political reform organizations. And California, in the last few years, has put in place citizens-based redistricting. We have modified the term limits. We have put in place a top 2 primary. And there are signs already, certainly there is the perception in the Capitol that those things have been thawing of the hyper-partisanship. There's been some other things, including some things that California Forward worked on around simple majority vote on the budget. So there really are some rules to the political process that we think over time will have the ability to encourage people to compromise. It encourages candidates to talk to everybody in the community, not just those who are going to vote in a rather partisan primary. Once they get to Sacramento, already the people that know that they can hold in their one seat for 12 years are thinking across a longer time frame. They're not trying to come up with 3 bills that really won't do anything but will get through so that they can now run for the Senate. You have people that are saying, I'm going to spend 12 years on the water committee and really try to solve that problem. So we're really starting, these aren't perfect, right? But these are all incremental changes. Clearly we need to make some changes to our fiscal system. And this has got to do with the whole range. What do we tax? How do we make budget decisions? And how do we make sure the money's well spent? And California Forward has been building out models for that and working in each of those areas. And we've had some success, and we've got a whole lot more work to do. But part of this is, where's the money come from? How do we decide that it's going to get spent? And how do we know that it's going to bring us our highest value? And again, there has been some progress on that in the last few years. And some of it is in the shadow of this Great Recession and the temporary taxes. But don't forget that we had a pretty complicated, hard to manage, volatile revenue system before the Great Recession, and we will even as the economy recovers. Just to kind of show you this is a one step at a time deal, we'd been advocating all along about how the state should be managing a relatively volatile income stream. And there's things you can do to make it less volatile, but there's also things you can do to manage that. And now we have a measure that's actually on the November ballot. The governor wants to improve on it. The governor's on the right track. So that's a place that I think, especially for those of you who are on the receiving end of state dollars, that having a stable revenue system that could be counted on through the swings of the economy would really be helpful. And then there's some structural fixes that we need to do. And most of these have to do with the relationship among governments. There's a lot of government in California, right? We got scores of state agencies that oftentimes don't talk to each other or coordinate. We got 58 counties, 480 cities, right? 1,000 K-12 districts, 173, I think, community college districts, right? Lots of government, 2,000 enterprise special districts, no one's quite sure the real number. And we know that a lot of the changes that we're going to have to do is the relationships among those and the clarities. And one of the things that happened, one of the negative consequences of Prop 13 was we shifted fiscal purse string power to Sacramento. And that's really been one of the complicating factors. And you see this governor, who was obviously around when Prop 13 passed, through his work, he's been trying to shift that responsibility back to local governments. It's controversial, it's hard, but it's trying to undo that consequence. And we'll see that both with public safety, and we're seeing that with the K-12 local control funding formula. So this is a pretty dynamic situation, and I think we've got some confusion and conflict to go before we realize the benefits of all of them, but we will. Now I want to shift gears just a little bit and say California Forward about 3 years ago started looking and saying, what are the pieces that are just missing? What are the decisions that aren't being made because we really don't have a way of making them? They're not just really caught up in hyper-partisanship, or this really doesn't stem from the complicated fiscal system or the complexity of governments. And the first one was that the state has honestly struggled in what decisions it should do to encourage economic vitality and job growth, right? I mean, we've created departments and agencies and gotten rid of them, right? There actually was no place within the government that was focused even on what the state needed to do to coordinate. And we started a project about 3 years ago that said, look, we don't have one economy in the state of California. That's our problem. We've got a series of metro-based regional economies, right? And if you want to read a fabulous book out of Brookings, read The Metropolitan Revolution, which does this great job of describing metropolitan-based regional economies and what metropolitan leaders, public, private, and civic, have done to grow vitality in those. It's really a fabulous book. Whether you're interested in economics, whether you're interested in education, whether you're interested in sociology, whether you're interested in poverty, it's a really kind of a good read. And California Forward, working with our regional organizations, have started to set this up. And we've got 400 people working on action teams developing precise recommendations for what can happen in order to improve the workforce development, in order to improve the regulatory process, in order to improve access to capital, private access to capital to entrepreneurs. How do we sync this up and link it up? Lots of great energy, lots of great ideas coming out of that, and a legislature now much interested in doing that. The second big place was, I said part of our problem was getting the responsibility back to local governments. And what we're seeing as we push that responsibility back to local governments, that local governments realize they have a much better chance to do it better. And so California Forward has been working directly with counties, principally, and soon we'll start working with some school districts around how do they actually do a better job of assessing opportunities to be moving the needle on some of these complicated problems. And AB 109, this public safety realignment you may have heard a bit about, is the first needle, where you now have counties that recognize that they need to put in integrated, data-driven, evidence-based decision-making if they really want to move the needle on reducing drug and alcohol abuse, getting people with mental illness out of jails. If they don't want to just replicate the failure of the state prison system here in Orange County or in Los Angeles or San Diego, they're going to have to do it different. And that's requiring them to fundamentally think not only about how they work, but how they work with their public sector partners. It's really, really fascinating, and we've been working with them to try to build those models out. And then finally, as was mentioned in several of the previous presentations, technology is the accelerator for change through all of this. And government is significant. If the IOUs are behind the private industry, the private energy industry, well, the government is behind the investor-owned utilities, right? And so we clearly have to build capacity and competency and culture within government to be using technology to drive its own decision-making and improve its own costs. We simply have to be able to do that. If you look at our cost of delivering certain services, we're not going to be able to be competitive in that global market if it takes as long and costs as much as it has in the past. And that's that kind of imperative. You know, the government puts out a lot of economic data. And about 20 years ago, it stopped collecting data on productivity in government. It actually stopped. It assumed that we can't measure it and we shouldn't. And now what you see in the transformational governments, the ones that are moving the needle on these issues, it's because they are adopting a culture of performance. of figuring out what is it we're really trying to do and how are we going to get there, and how do we wake up every day, just like they do in any other successful enterprise, figuring out how we're going to keep a young person from graduating from juvenile justice to the adult justice system, how we're going to take a family struggling with poverty and move them to self-sufficiency. It's a very exciting thing. Technology is clearly going to be the accelerator for us to make those change. So I thank you very much. I don't know if we have time for a question or two, but appreciate being here and your attention.
Thanks, Jim.